The word your English Bible translates as pillar in Genesis 19:26 is not the Hebrew word for a column. It is not the word for a statue. It is netziv, the exact same word the Bible uses for a military garrison, a strategic post, a monument deliberately placed to mark a position, which means Lot's wife was not punished. She was assigned. She was turned into a landmark, something God placed on the edge of Sodom's ruins on purpose. And when you understand what a military garrison means in the ancient world and why God chose salt of all substances to build it with, the most familiar story in the Bible becomes something you have never heard before. The text of Genesis 19 describes a scene of complete urban collapse. Two angels arrive in the city of Sodom at evening. Lot meets them at the gate. He insists they come to his house. During the night, every single male of Sodom, from young to old, surrounds Lot's house, demanding that he send the visitors out so they can sexually assault them. The angels strike the mob blind, and then they tell Lot something that functions like a countdown. Get everyone out. Sons-in-law, sons, daughters, anyone you have in this city, get them out, because we are about to destroy this place. That phrase in Hebrew, Ki mashchitim anachnu et hamakom hazeh, is stark. We are about to destroy this place. The destruction of Sodom is not framed as a distant event, not a future judgment, not a warning to repent. It is imminent, hours away. And Lot's response is remarkable. He goes to his sons-in-law, men who had married his daughters, and tells them to flee. And the text says they thought he was joking. They stayed. They died with the city. Now we arrive at dawn. The angels physically grab Lot, his wife, and his two daughters who were still living with him. The Hebrew verb used here, vayachaziku, means to seize by force. These angels do not persuade Lot. They drag him, they drag his wife, they drag his daughters, because Lot is hesitating. Even in the face of the most direct angelic intervention in the patriarchal narratives, Lot is slow. He lingers, and the text gives us a devastating editorial note in verse 16. While he lingered, the men seized his hand, and the hand of his wife, and the hands of his two daughters, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and set him outside the city. The reason Lot is slow to move is significant. We will come back to it. But understand this, the angels physically remove this family from Sodom, and then they give the command that Lot's wife will violate. Escape for your life. Do not look behind you. Do not stop anywhere in the plain. Escape to the mountains, lest you be swept away. 4 imperatives, 4 commands, all pointing in the same direction, forward, away. Do not stop. Do not look back. And then, the most important verse in the whole passage for understanding what is about to happen. Verse 23. The sun had risen over the land when Lot came to Zoar. Zoar is a small town at the edge of the plain, to which Lot had begged to flee instead of the mountains. And then verse 24, then the Lord rained on Sodom and on Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And verse 25, and he overthrew those cities, and all the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground. And then verse 26, the 11 words that have puzzled the world for 3,000 years. But his wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Now, let's stop here, because most people read that sequence and assume the logic is simple. She disobeyed, she got punished. But when you look closely at the Hebrew, really closely, something far stranger and more profound emerges, and it begins with the verb. The Hebrew word translated looked back is vatabit. It comes from the root nbt, which means to look with intentionality, to gaze, to fix your eyes on something deliberately. This is not the Hebrew word for a quick glance over your shoulder. There are other Hebrew words for that, The word NBT carries the weight of intentional, sustained attention. It is the same root used in Numbers 21.9 when the people bitten by serpents were told to look at the bronze serpent Moses raised, and they lived. That act of looking was an act of deliberate life or death faith. The same verb, but here the direction is reversed. The intentional gaze is backward, toward what is being destroyed. And the question every careful reader must ask is, what was she looking for? Or more precisely, what was she unable to leave? Here is where Lot's wife moves from a flat cautionary figure to a deeply human one. Her name does not appear anywhere in the canonical Hebrew Bible. Genesis 19 never tells us her name. The rabbinical tradition tries to fill this gap. The Midrash gives her the name Ado, or in some traditions Edith, a name derived from the Hebrew Edut, meaning testimony or witness, which is striking when you consider that the pillar of salt she becomes was itself a form of testimony, a witness. But her namelessness in the text is itself significant. In a culture where names carry enormous theological weight, where God renames Abram to Abraham, where Jacob becomes Israel, where names mark covenants and callings, the absence of a name for this woman is not an oversight, it is a statement. What we do know about Lot's wife is what we can infer from her context. She lived in Sodom. She had daughters who were still at home, unmarried, and daughters who had already married men of Sodom. Her sons-in-law were in the city. Her world was in Sodom. Everything she had built, every friendship, every connection, every familiar stone and street and face was behind her. And as the sulfur fell, and the sky turned orange, and the earth shook, and the city that had been her home for years began to dissolve in fire, she turned to look at it one last time. And in that moment, she became what she was already spiritually, a monument to what she was unwilling to release. This is the interpretation that the rabbinical tradition leans into most heavily. The Midrash Rabbah suggests that Lot's wife was concerned for her daughters who remained in the city, that her looking back was not mere curiosity but grief, maternal anguish. Some commentators read extraordinary sympathy into this act, but the New Testament refuses that reading, at least as a model to follow. And we will get to that in a few minutes. Because Jesus himself will have something to say about Lot's wife, something specific enough and sudden enough that it changes everything about how we are supposed to remember her. But first, why salt? To a modern reader, turning into salt sounds almost arbitrary. Why not stone? Why not ash? Why not simply death? But in the ancient Near Eastern world, and specifically within the covenant theology of the Hebrew Bible, salt was not arbitrary at all. Salt was one of the most theologically and culturally loaded substances in existence. Understanding salt in the biblical world is the key to unlocking what the text means when it says Lot's wife became a pillar of it. Salt in the ancient world was simultaneously precious, essential, and destructive. On one side, it preserved food in a world without refrigeration. It was traded as currency. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt. The word salary derives from the Latin salarium, the salt ration or payment. Salt was a symbol of preservation, of permanence, of that which does not decay. In the Hebrew Bible, the covenant between God and Israel is specifically called a covenant of salt, Brit Melach, in Numbers 18:19. And in 2 Chronicles 13:5, God is said to have given the kingship to David and his sons by a covenant of salt, meaning an inviolable, permanent, everlasting covenant. Salt meant permanence. It meant what could not be taken back. But salt also destroyed. An army that wanted to permanently ruin a conquered city would plow salt into its fields, rendering the land sterile, unable to produce crops for years or even decades. Judges 9:45 records that Abimelech razed the city and sowed it with salt after destroying Shechem. The Romans famously salted the ruins of Carthage, a tradition that historians now debate as to its extent, but whose symbolism was clearly understood. Salt on a city meant not just defeat, but permanent erasure. Salt meant judgment. It meant a landscape rendered permanently unlivable. And in Deuteronomy 29:23, one of the most haunting descriptions of divine judgment in the Torah, the land that turns from God is described as burning sulfur and salt. Nothing planted, nothing sprouting, no vegetation growing on it, like the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim. Salt and sulfur together, the signature of total annihilation. The description in Deuteronomy specifically references Sodom as the archetype of this kind of judgment, which means that when Lot's wife becomes a pillar of salt, she is not simply being punished with a convenient substance nearby. She is being incorporated into the very symbol of what Sodom's destruction meant. She is becoming the judgment she refused to flee. This dual nature of salt, covenant and destruction, preservation and sterility, the permanent and the deadly, makes it the perfect substance for what Lot's wife represents. She was on the edge of covenant. She was in the family of the one man God chose to preserve from Sodom's destruction. She was in the process of being saved, and she turned back. And in turning back, she became the thing itself, a permanent monument of what happens when someone is called out of judgment and looks back into it. Now let's talk about the land, because here is something that most Bible studies never tell you. The region where this story takes place, the southern end of the Dead Sea in what is today the Araba Valley on the border of Israel and Jordan, is one of the saltiest, most geologically extreme environments on Earth. The Dead Sea itself is nearly 10 times saltier than ocean water. Nothing lives in it. No fish, no plants, no marine biology of any kind. At 430 meters below sea level, it is the lowest point on the surface of the Earth. The land around it is white with salt deposits. The air carries the smell of mineral compounds. And along the southwestern shore, there is a mountain, known today as Har Sodom in Hebrew, or Mount Sodom, that is composed almost entirely of halite, rock salt. It is approximately 11 kilometers long, 2 to 3 kilometers wide, and rises to about 250 meters. It is a mountain of salt. And on that mountain of salt, there are natural salt pillars. Pillars formed by erosion, by rain cutting through the soft halite and leaving standing columns of crystallized sodium chloride. Some of them are humanoid in shape. Some of them stand alone on exposed ridges, buffeted by the wind. The local tradition, ancient, persistent, and geographically specific, has always identified one of these pillars as the remains of Lot's wife. The ancient Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century CE, mentions it explicitly. In his Jewish Antiquities, Book 1, Chapter 11, he writes, "But Lot's wife, continually turning back to view the city as she went from it, and being too nicely inquisitive about it when she was already at the borders of the Jordan, was changed into a pillar of salt. For I have seen it, and it remains at this day." Josephus claims to have personally seen the pillar. Whether that specific pillar has survived the intervening 2 millennia in any identifiable form is another matter. Salt pillars are not permanent. Erosion cuts them down, and tradition has recycled the identification from pillar to pillar over the centuries. But the mountain is still there. The salt is still there. The geological conditions that produce natural salt columns are still actively producing them. The land itself is exactly what the story requires it to be. And there is more. In the 1970s and 1980s, archaeologists working at 2 sites on the eastern shore of the Dead Sea, Bab el-Adra and its sister site Numeira, discovered something that made headlines across the archaeological community. Both sites showed evidence of massive, sudden destruction, the kind of destruction that involves intense heat, burned buildings, ash layers, mud brick walls that had been superheated and calcified. And both sites date to approximately 2300 to 2000 BCE. placing them squarely within the range of the traditional dating for Abraham, Lot, and the destruction of Sodom. Some archaeologists, most notably Bryant Wood and later Stephen Collins working at a separate site called Tall El Hammam in Jordan, have argued for the identification of these sites with the biblical cities of the plain. The debate is ongoing. The scholarly consensus has not unified around any single identification. But what no serious archaeologist disputes is this: the geology of the southern Dead Sea Basin shows evidence of massive ancient seismic and volcanic events. The region sits on the Dead Sea Transform Fault, one of the most active fault lines in the Middle East. And beneath the salt flats at the southern end of the Dead Sea, there are deposits of natural bitumen and sulfur that could, under the right conditions, have been ejected by seismic activity and ignited. The fire and brimstone that rained on Sodom may have had a very specific, very real geological trigger, which does not diminish the miraculous framing of the text. It makes it more precise. God's judgment in this reading used the land's own geology as its instrument. The land judged Sodom with what it was made of, and Lot's wife became part of that geology. She became what the land was. Now we need to talk about the command itself, because the command is not what most people think it is. Do not look behind you. Lo tabitacharecha. That phrase in its context is not simply a rule designed to test obedience. Commands in the Hebrew Bible are not arbitrary tests of compliance. They carry meaning, they carry protection. They define a boundary between what is being left behind and what is being moved toward. And this particular command, do not look behind you, is given in the context of a rescue. These people are being extracted from a zone of annihilation, and the boundary the angels establish is a boundary of survival. To cross that boundary, to look back, is not just disobedience. It is a reorientation of the soul. It is placing your gaze, your attention, your identity back inside the thing you are being rescued from. Think about what the command asks these four people to do. Lot had built his life in Sodom. He had first moved there because the land of the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere like the garden of the Lord. Genesis 13:10. He had chosen comfort and prosperity over the risks of the open country. He had eventually become a significant figure in the city, sitting in the gate, which in the ancient world was the position of a judge or community leader. He had daughters married into Sodom. He had a household, and his wife had all of this too. The command, do not look back, asks them not just to run. It asks them to make a definitive, physical, visible commitment to the direction of their salvation. The act of looking forward, keeping your eyes on where you are going, not on where you have been, is itself a form of faith. It is a declaration that the past is being left behind. That rescue is more valuable than what was lost. And Lot's wife could not make that declaration, not completely, not with her body. There is a reason that Lot's hesitation before leaving the city is in the text. And there is a reason that even after the family escapes to Zoar, Lot immediately becomes frightened and flees to the mountains anyway, afraid that even Zoar is too close to the destruction. Lot himself is deeply ambivalent. He is saved, but barely. He is righteous in 2 Peter 2:7-8. The New Testament calls him a righteous man, tormented by what he saw in Sodom. But his righteousness is partial, conflicted, achieved almost against his own instincts. His wife shares that ambivalence. The difference is that Lot keeps moving forward, his wife physically turns. And here is where the story reaches its most uncomfortable theological truth. The text does not say she wished she were back in Sodom. It does not say she regretted leaving. It says she looked back. That is all, and that was enough. Because the command was not, do not wish you were back in Sodom. The command was not, do not feel sad about what you are leaving. The command was specific, physical, embodied. Do not look behind you. And the moment she violated it, the moment she turned her physical gaze backward, she was transformed into the thing she could not stop being drawn to. She became a monument of that backward orientation, permanently, publicly, in the landscape that would mark the spot where Sodom had been. Now we come to the moment that changes how all of this lands. Luke 17, Jesus is speaking to his disciples about the coming of the kingdom of God. The Pharisees have asked him when the kingdom will come, and Jesus says it will not come with signs that can be observed. It will be sudden, unexpected, and it will require a decision. He describes the days of Noah, when people were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage, right up until the day Noah entered the ark. And then the flood came and destroyed them all. And then he says this, "Likewise, just as it was in the days of Lot, they were eating and drinking, buying and selling, planting and building. But on the day when Lot went out from Sodom, fire and sulfur rained from heaven and destroyed them all. So will it be on the day when the Son of Man is revealed." And then, without transition, without explanation, with the brevity of a man who expects to be understood, he adds, "Remember Lot's wife." 3 words in the English. In the Greek, mnemonuetetes genaiakos Lot. In 3 words, Jesus turns a 3,000-year-old story into the central warning of an eschatological moment. Not remember Sodom, not remember the fire, remember Lot's wife, the woman who was almost saved, the woman who was in the process of salvation and turned back. And he immediately follows that with verse 33. "Whoever seeks to preserve his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life will keep it." The connection is direct. Lot's wife sought to preserve something she was being called to release, and in seeking to preserve it, she lost everything, including herself. What Jesus is saying here is not primarily about ancient geography. He is saying, when the moment of ultimate decision comes, when the Son of Man is revealed, there will be people who are in the process of being saved, and they will look back. They will hesitate. They will try to hold on to the world they are leaving, and that hesitation, that backward gaze, will be the thing that undoes them. Lot's wife is not a lesson about fire and salt. Lot's wife is a lesson about the cost of divided loyalty at a moment that demands complete commitment. Jesus uses her as the summary image of what not to do when redemption is in motion. Not bad people, not obvious rebels, a woman who was almost there. And now we can understand why the pillar was made of salt. Salt in the covenant tradition is the symbol of permanence and perpetual obligation. When God made the covenant of salt with David, Brit Melach, he was saying, "This cannot be unmade. This stands forever. It is fixed in place." Lot's wife, in becoming a pillar of salt, becomes a fixed, permanent, visible expression of her divided loyalty. She does not dissolve. She does not fade. She stands on the edge of the plain, facing Sodom. Salt, which in the biblical world was both the symbol of covenant faithfulness and the instrument of judgment on covenant breakers, makes her simultaneously a monument to judgment and a monument to the covenant she was so close to entering fully. She is the unfulfilled covenant made visible, the permanent record of the moment somebody stood on the threshold of salvation and turned back. And consider this, the word netziv, the word translated pillar, is used twice in the books of Samuel in relation to Philistine garrisons, military outposts, positions strategically placed to hold territory. In 1 Samuel 10:5, a company of prophets comes down from the hill of God, where the Philistine garrison, Netziv, is. In 1 Samuel 13:3, Jonathan attacks the Philistine garrison. A Netziv marks the boundary of a controlled zone. It says, "This land belongs to this power. This far and no further." When Lot's wife becomes a Netziv, a pillar, a garrison post, she is marking the boundary of Sodom's reach. She is the last human expression of the world that was destroyed, a standing marker of a kingdom that no longer exists. She is Sodom's final monument. The city fell, she remained, and in remaining she marks, permanently, the place where the judgment fell. A standing witness against everything that Sodom represented. Now let's go even deeper, because there is a layer to this story that requires thinking about Lot's family as a unit, not just his wife, all of them. 4 people left Sodom: Lot, his wife, 2 daughters. Of the 4, 1 does not make it out. That is Lot's wife. The 3 who do survive immediately face the next crisis. There is nowhere to go. Lot had begged the angels to let him flee to Zoar, this small city, rather than the mountains. The angels had granted it. But when Lot arrived at Zoar, the text says he was afraid to live there. He took his 2 daughters and fled to the mountains after all. And then begins one of the most disturbing episodes in Genesis. Lot and his daughters live in a cave in the mountains. His daughters, having lost their promised husbands who died in Sodom, believing there are no other men on earth to carry on the family line, make a decision that the text narrates with brutal matter-of-factness. On 2 successive nights, they get their father drunk and sleep with him, and from those unions come 2 sons, Moab, ancestor of the Moabites, and Ben-Ami, ancestor of the Ammonites. The family that left Sodom was deeply marked by it. The sons-in-law who stayed were dead. The mother was a pillar of salt. The father was so passive and confused by grief and fear that his own daughters were able to execute this plan without his knowledge. And the daughters themselves, having grown up in Sodom, having been offered to the Sodomite mob by their own father in a desperate attempt to satisfy the crowd, having lost the men they were supposed to marry, made decisions that bore the imprint of the environment they came from. The story of Lot's family after Sodom is the story of Sodom's legacy. And Lot's wife, the salt pillar standing on the plain, is the most honest symbol of all of it, something that could not fully leave the city even as the city burned. Now, what does this mean for us? What is the actual weight of this story beyond its historical and theological layers? There is a reason Jesus chose this particular image. 3 words, remember Lot's wife, as his closing summary of what disciples should avoid when the kingdom breaks in. It is not a warning against curiosity. It is not a warning against nostalgia as such. It is a warning against a specific kind of spiritual paralysis, the inability to fully commit to the direction of your redemption. The inability to stop being defined by what you are being called out of. Most people who read their Bible know about Lot. Very few people know his wife's name. Most of those who know the story remember it as she turned around and turned into salt. The end. But when you trace the Hebrew verb, NBT, the intentional sustained gaze, when you understand the dual theology of salt, covenant and judgment fused into one substance, when you walk the geography of the southern Dead Sea, where natural salt pillars still rise from the white earth today, when you read Josephus claiming to have seen the pillar with his own eyes in the 1st century, when you hear Jesus 3,000 years after the event pointing to this unnamed woman as the defining cautionary image for a generation that will face the final moment of decision, the story becomes something enormous, something that is not safely in the past. The theological question this story poses is not what happened to Lot's wife. The question it poses is, what is the thing in your life that, when you are being called forward, keeps turning your gaze backward? What is the thing you cannot stop calculating the value of, even in the middle of being rescued from it? Because the text does not say Lot's wife ran back to Sodom. She did not try to return. She just looked back. One moment, one direction. And that one sustained, intentional backward gaze was enough to tell the whole truth about where she really was. There is a phrase in Hebrews 11, the great chapter of faith, that describes Moses. It says, "He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward." The word Looking there in the Greek is apoblepo, to look away from one thing toward another. Moses looked away from Egypt. He redirected his sustained gaze. He chose where his NBT would fall, and he made it fall on the promise ahead of him, not on the palace behind him. The contrast with Lot's wife could not be more complete. Moses looked away from what he was leaving. Lot's wife looked back at it. And the Hebrew verb NBT appears in both directions, as faith and as its failure. Now there is one more thing we need to address, and it is perhaps the strangest detail in this whole story. A detail that nobody talks about, and that nobody fully explains. It is this: why was the command given at all? If God was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah regardless of whether Lot's family watched, what difference did it make if they looked back? Were they in danger from the fire? Perhaps. The text says the destruction was catastrophic and total, and proximity to it might have been lethal. But the command, "do not look back," carries an intention beyond physical safety. Look at the language again. Escape for your life. Do not look behind you. Do not stop anywhere in the plain. Under 3 commands in sequence. The second one, "do not look behind you," sits between escape for your life and do not stop. It is structurally connected to movement, to momentum. The command does not say, "do not look at Sodom." It says, "do not look behind you." The orientation, the direction of your body and gaze determines whether you are still in the act of fleeing or whether you have already mentally returned. This connects to something deep in biblical anthropology. The Hebrew concept of the heart, lev, is not a seat of emotion as we use the word in English. It is the seat of the will, the decision-making center, the place where a person is most themselves. And in the Hebrew worldview, the direction of the body expresses the direction of the heart. Turning to face something is an expression of commitment to it. Turning away from something is an expression of releasing it. The command, "do not look behind you," is a command about the orientation of the heart. And when Lot's wife turns, she expresses, in the most visible, physical, embodied way possible, that her heart has not yet left Sodom. Her body is still moving forward, but her gaze, her NBT, her intentional, sustained attention has swung back. And in that moment, body and heart become permanently aligned with what her gaze has chosen. She becomes the thing she looked back at. She becomes the judgment she was fleeing. She becomes part of the landscape of the destroyed city she could not stop looking at. And this is the detail that no one explains, not because scholars do not notice it, but because it is too uncomfortable to sit with for long. Because if you sit with it long enough, you realize the story is not really about Lot's wife. It is about the moment, the precise, unrepeatable moment when a person in the middle of being saved makes a decision about what they value most. And the text says, the moment was instantaneous. Verse 26 is one Hebrew sentence. There is no pause. There is no extended conflict. She looked back. She became a pillar. The speed of it is part of the point. There is no gradual return to Sodom. There is no long, drawn-out process of backsliding. There is one backward gaze, and it is enough. 3,000 years later, across the world, in every language and every culture where this story has been told, the image of Lot's wife endures. Not because people find it comforting, but because people find it familiar. Because everyone has had a moment, or more than one moment, when they were in the process of being pulled away from something that was destroying them, and they looked back. Not out of stupidity, not out of rebellion, out of grief, out of attachment, out of the very human inability to release something that had been for a long time their world. Lot's wife is not a villain in this story. She is a deeply human figure caught in a deeply human moment. And the text does not gloat over her. It does not celebrate her fate. It records it and it leaves it standing, a netziv, a garrison post, a permanent marker on the edge of what was destroyed. and it waits for the reader to understand what they are seeing. Now let's talk about what became of the pillar itself, because the tradition did not stop with the text. The rabbinical literature develops a remarkable tradition around the pillar of salt. In the Midrash Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, one of the earlier compilations of Aggadic material from the land of Israel, the pillar of Lot's wife is described as existing into the present age. That is, the age in which the Midrash was written, somewhere between the 8th and 9th centuries CE. But more striking is this: the rabbis note that the pillar dissolves and regenerates. Salt pillars in the natural environment are indeed subject to erosion. Wind and rain wear them down, and the rabbinical tradition interpreted this as a continuous act of judgment. Each month animals lick the pillar down, and each month it grows back. The pillar can never fully disappear because the lesson it represents can never be allowed to be forgotten. The monument must remain. The garrison must hold its post. The Netziv must stand. Josephus, as we mentioned, claimed to have seen it in the 1st century CE. He was not the only ancient writer to make this claim. The early church father Clement of Rome, writing in the 90s CE, within a generation of Josephus, makes a passing reference to the pillar as a well-known landmark. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing in the late 2nd century, also mentions it. The pillar was, for centuries, both a theological symbol and a physical claim, a tourist attraction for pilgrims traveling through the Jordan Valley towards Sinai. Whether any of these ancient witnesses were looking at the same physical column, or simply at whatever natural salt formation local tradition pointed them to, is impossible to verify. But the pattern is significant. For 2,000 years, across multiple religious traditions and multiple generations of visitors to the Dead Sea region, the conviction that the pillar was still there, in some form, in some shape, on that salt mountain south of the sea, persisted. Today at Har Sodom, Mount Sodom on the southwestern shore of the Dead Sea, there is a natural salt pillar that the Israeli National Park Authority has marked with a sign identifying it, with a gentle archaeological neutrality, as Lot's wife. It is approximately 15 meters tall. It is made of halite, rock salt. It stands on an exposed ridge of the salt mountain, and the erosion patterns around it give it a rough humanoid silhouette. Tourists photograph it, pilgrims pray in front of it, and children ask the exact question we opened with: why did Lot's wife turn into salt? But now you know that the question is not quite the right one. The better question, the question that opens into everything we have been exploring, is what was the pillar made to mean? And the answer, laid out across the text of Genesis, across the theology of salt in the Hebrew Bible, across the geological reality of the Dead Sea Basin, across the words of Jesus in Luke 17, across 2,000 years of rabbinical and patristic tradition, is this: the pillar of salt is the most precise, the most theologically loaded, the most geographically and materially appropriate image the ancient text could have chosen to mark the moment when a human being stood on the threshold of deliverance and could not stop looking back. It is not a warning about curiosity. It is not a cautionary tale about disobedience in the simple sense. It is a portrait, permanent, standing white in the desert sun, of divided loyalty, of the heart that is being called forward but whose gaze has swung backward, of the soul that is almost saved. And the reason Jesus says, "Remember Lot's wife," in the same breath as his announcement of the coming of the Son of Man, is because he knows that the people who will be lost in that final moment will not be the obviously wicked. They will be the people who were almost there, who were in the process of moving toward him, who heard the command, who felt the pull of salvation, and who, in that last decisive moment, turned their gaze backward one more time toward what they had been called to release, and became in that moment monuments to the thing they could not let go. But before we arrive at the pillar, before we close with the image that the whole text has been building toward, there is one more theological strand that demands to be pulled, because the story of Lot's wife does not end in Genesis, and it does not end in Luke 17. It echoes forward all the way into the teaching of Paul and into the final chapters of Revelation itself, not by name, not with a direct citation, but with the same structural logic. The logic of the backward gaze, the logic of the person standing on the threshold of redemption who cannot fully release what is behind them. In Philippians 3, Paul writes something that has the shape of an autobiography, but functions as a direct address to the problem of Lot's wife. He lists his credentials: circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law a Pharisee, as to zeal a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law blameless. He had everything. He had the religious equivalent of what Lot's wife had: a world fully built, a life fully invested, an identity completely located in the structures he had been raised in. And then, but whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. And then the line that reads like a direct inversion of Genesis 19:26, forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead. I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Forgetting what lies behind. The Greek word epilanthonomenos, actively forgetting, deliberately releasing, consciously refusing to look back. Paul is describing the exact internal movement that Lot's wife was unable to make. She looked back at what she had counted as gain. Paul counted the same kind of thing as loss, and he trained his eyes forward. Straining forward, the Greek epektinomai, means to stretch out toward something ahead. Every muscle extended in the direction of the promise. Every fiber of attention locked on what is ahead and not what has been. It is the anti-Lot's wife posture, and Paul does not arrive at it easily. He arrives at it after losing everything, after his Damascus Road encounter stripped him of his certainty, his status, and his identity in one blinding moment. He knows what it costs to not look back, and he prescribes it anyway, because he knows what happens to people who can't stop looking. And then there is the image in Revelation 21, the New Jerusalem descending from heaven, the new creation, a world made entirely new, in which the old order, every tear, every death, every mourning and crying and pain has passed away. And the one sitting on the throne says, "Behold, I am making all things new." And then the description of what this new world is made of: jasper and clear crystal, gold like transparent glass, 12 gates each of a single pearl, and the foundations of the wall adorned with every kind of jewel. And at the center, the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God. The tree of life on both sides of the river, bearing 12 kinds of fruit, its leaves for the healing of the nations. It is the ultimate anti-Sodom, the ultimate anti-salt plain. Where Sodom was destruction and salt and sulfur and the death of what refused to be redeemed, the New Jerusalem is living water and fruit-bearing trees and a city that needs no sun because the glory of God illuminates it. The contrast is absolute. The direction is absolute. There is nothing behind worth looking at in a world where everything ahead is made entirely new. Revelation 21 is what you receive when you do not look back. And Genesis 19:26 is what you become when you do. The pillar is still there, or one very much like it is still there, salt and white and standing in the low sun above the lowest point on the surface of the earth. And it asks the only question that matters: when the moment comes, when the fire falls and the angels grab your hand and the command goes out to move forward and not look back, where will your gaze be? Where your gaze falls is where your heart lives. And where your heart lives is what you become.